Okay, I think we're live, and I know I promised that I would do this another day, but I needed to do another video today just because it is Friday, and rather than waiting until next week to do this, uh, I figured this is appropriate since it is Friday to do Surah 62, which is entitled Friday. In Arabic, it is Al-Jum'ah. So the Juma prayer is the Friday prayer. So this is a description of the assembly, the convocation of Muslims that happens on Friday, and it's also the name of the specific prayer, which replaces the Zuhr or midday prayer on this day. So it's the title is Friday. It's a description of the assembly of Muslims on Friday, but also the name of the prayer, the Juma prayer. So just like Rebecca Black, for those of you who remember, Friday, Friday, gotta get down on Friday. That viral video produced by a girl whose parents wanted to turn her into a YouTube star, or not necessarily YouTube star, but a singing sensation. They paid a lot of money to have that universally mocked video produced. Friday. So Friday, the Muslims get down on Friday by going to their prayer and doing the Juma prayer, which I think is um, the fourth prayer of the day. And it begins with the Bismillah, in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. And this is one of the surahs that serves as a glorification of Allah. So it begins, whatever is in the heavens and whatever is in the earth declares the glory of Allah, the King, the Holy, the Mighty, the Wise. He it is who raised among the inhabitants of Mecca an apostle from among themselves, who recites to them his communications and purifies them, and teaches them the book and the wisdom, although they were before certainly in clear error. And it's not specified what error it is, but presumably the error in not being Muslim. And the irony here is that he says they're in error. You would assume he's referring to the pagan forms of worship of the Quraysh, of his tribe, and the Arabians in general, the worship of these pagan idols. Hi, Miss Bluebird. But again, it raises this question of how did Islam exist before Muhammad? Because you have these two currents in Islam. One saying Muhammad was the first Muslim, and in fact, it says that in the Quran he was the first to submit to Allah. But the other strand saying, no, Islam has existed since Adam. And in fact, this is one of the chief conceits of Islam, that there was no original sin, there was no fall. So everyone is born a Muslim, and when someone converts to Islam, they call them reverts. They're simply reverting to their original state. The people are born sinless, and they're born Muslim, and they fall into idolatry, i.e., not being a Muslim. So they need to be returned to Islam. Hi, Inky. Thanks. Thanks for the compliment. So that's the Muslim belief, that there was no original sin, there was no fall, and it presents problems because if there was no fall, then why why does the world abound in sin, and why are there so few people that are actually Muslim? Why is 80% of the world non-Muslim? If if there was no fall, if sin, if cleansing sin, or there's no need for an atonement, and there was no fall, then why is there so much sin in the world? Why is there so much strife? And why are there so few people who are actually Muslim? particularly when you examine the habits and the beliefs of those who are called Muslims and compare them with the Quran and the Hadith, and you can see how they all fall well short of that mark. So Muslims have to reconcile these two conflicting beliefs: the idea that Muhammad was the first Muslim, which is an accurate assumption. He was the first Muslim, and the idea that Islam has always existed and that what preceded Muhammad, this pagan idolatry, was simply people turning away from Islam. These are two concepts that are never truly reconciled, and that a Muslim can't honestly account for. He can't explain why how Muhammad can be the first Muslim or the first to submit to Allah, and yet Islam has existed since the dawn of mankind. But in but in verse 2, when it says he's raised among the inhabitants of Mecca and Apostle, this also speaks to the ethnocentrism of Islam. The the problem with Islam is that in order to become a Muslim, you have to become an Arab. You have to adopt Arabic ways of dress. You have to speak Arabic. You have to understand Arabic just to understand the Quran. Because when you go to a mosque, the muezzin, he's not reciting these verses in the vernacular. He's not telling you what he's not telling you what the Quran says in your language, so you don't understand it. In order to understand it, you have to learn Arabic, and that's why they have all of these tools like Arabic Quest. You see these ads on YouTube teaching people how to learn Arabic. Why is learning Arabic important? Unless you're living in the Middle East for business purposes or for family purposes, there's no real utility to learning Arabic. It doesn't help you. Um, I mean, it helps you if you're a Christian apologist whose ministry is to Muslims, and you have to speak to people who come from the Middle East. Then it's useful, but otherwise, it's not really that useful at all. So Muhammad needs to ground his religion in the Arabian Peninsula, and this is the problem with Islam. It's not a universal religion. If you're a Christian, uh, if you're a Korean Christian, you can still eat Korean food. You can still eat kimchi, and you can still listen to Korean music, folk music, and you can be a Korean even though you worship Christ. And the same thing, if you're an American and you live in New York, you can still have a culture that's unique. You don't need to forsake your culture or your language. You can still speak English and worship Christ and fellowship with other believers. And this goes throughout the world, whether you're in Lebanon or Ghana, Accra, Ghana, or Beirut, Lebanon, or um, Pyongyang, North Korea, wherever. You don't have to completely forsake your culture in order to worship Christ. Whereas in Islam, you have to become an Arab in order to become a Muslim. The two are intertwined. They're inescapable. These two strands, and this is um, why you see Bengalis or Indians or Pakistanis. They're called Desis, the ones that are born in the United States. Why you see them complaining about discrimination when they go to the mosque or when they go outside of their own local community. Because Muhammad situated it so as to exalt his people and his particular very parochial culture. I mean, there's no reason in order to there's no reason that you would need to speak Arabic in order to fellowship with believers or to worship God. But that's the situation you have in Islam. You have a very ethnocentric, Arab focused way of worship. And Muhammad explains this as Allah kind of raising up these people and bestowing his favor onto them. But the problem is isn't really scriptural when you think about it. In Islam, Muslims are the people themselves are exalted. It's not it's not like it is in the Bible where you have God exalted. In Islam, it's the complete opposite. You have men exalted. So Muslims think of themselves as unique and special, and they think of whatever distinction they earned. They think that that's incumbent upon them to brag about it and show it because they're being favored by Allah. So it in contrast to Christianity, where you have God exalted, or in terms of like a Bible believing Christianity, the real church, you have God exalted. In Islam, it's the complete opposite. You have man exalted. So here, when it says he raised up among the inhabitants of Mecca an apostle from among themselves, you have people exalted, but particularly one person, which is Muhammad. And in 3, it says, and others from among them who have not yet joined them, and he is the mighty, the wise. That is Allah's grace. He grants it to whom he pleases, and Allah is the Lord of mighty grace. But look at how he describes grace. Grace, a a proper understanding of grace is unmerited favor. In other words, this is something that God extends to mankind, and they do not deserve it. In other words, that's why in hymns like "Amazing Grace," you have uh, people who were sinners who marvel at the fact that God would extend grace to them, even though they're completely undeserving and unworthy of it. But Muhammad's idea of grace is elevating first first of all elevating him, but also by extension the people who are following him. So it's kind of an inversion of the proper understanding of grace when you think of grace and how it's the center of salvation, a completely God centered act where he goes in and he rescues someone from uh, eternal condemnation. So Muhammad has kind of inverted this idea of grace, and that's what you find in most other, particularly works-based soteriologies, where it centers around you achieving something or trying to earn your salvation. You'll see grace. Even religions that acknowledge the idea of grace, they mitigate it. So and Paul said this quite openly. He said, if it's of works, then it's not of grace. If you have to add works to it, then it nullifies the idea of grace. So you'll have these religions that acknowledge grace, but by adulterating it or adding conditions to it, they're essentially nullifying it. So, for example, the Amish believe in grace, but they have all of these codicils and caveats where it's grace plus honoring your parents um, and adhering to a baptism covenant, or uh, or respecting community standards of dress, and so on and so forth. Or in Sikhism, you have the idea of grace as something that counteracts karma, which is found nowhere in the Bible. So even religions and beliefs that acknowledge the idea of grace, most of them usually have something that nullifies or negates the concept of grace within that affirmation of faith. But belief in the Bible, in Christ, um, shows you that grace is completely and wholly the work of God, and it's salvation by grace through faith, and only faith, not faith conditioned on all of these other caveats and codicils and regulations. So in 5, it says, the likeness of those who were charged with the Torah, i.e., the Torah, then they did not observe it. It is as the likeness of the ass bearing books. Evil is the likeness of the people who reject the communications of Allah, and Allah does not guide the unjust people. Say, O you who are Jews, if you think that you are the favorites of Allah to the exclusion of other people, then invoke death if you are truthful. And again, this is Muhammad challenging, in this case, Jews, but he does this in other parts of the Quran with Christians, with the pagans in his own tribe, the Quraysh, saying, if you really believe what you believe, then invoke death. And they will never invoke it, and this is verse 7, because of what their hands have sent before, and Allah is cognizant of the unjust. And the irony here is that Muhammad is attacking Jews for their pride, but in the same surah and in countless other surahs, he's saying that Muslims should be prideful. He's saying that Muslims should take comfort or solace in the fact that they were chosen by God because they're special. So in essence, he's condemning the Jews for doing precisely what he's doing throughout the Quran. But again, Muslims will never acknowledge the inherent hypocrisy of this. In 8, it says, say, as for the death from which you flee, that will surely overtake you. Then you shall be sent back to the knower of the unseen and the seen, and he will inform you of that which you did. O you who believe, when the call is made for prayer on Friday, then hasten to the remembrance of Allah and leave off trading. That is better for you if you know. But when the prayer is ended, then disperse abroad in the land and seek of Allah's grace, and remember Allah much, that you may be successful. And when they see merchandise or sport, they break up for it and leave you standing. Say, what is with Allah is better than sport and better than merchandise, and Allah is the best of sustainers. Again, one of the honorifics attached to Allah. But here, this is interesting because the Muslim countries still adhere scrupulously to this, even ones that are not controlled by Salafi or Wahhabi influenced governments. They adhere to this idea scrupulously of you not being able to trade, not being able to particularly eat, and eating in public in countries, even Muslim countries that are supposedly moderate or less radical than others, like Morocco, say, or Egypt. Even there, you can't eat or drink in public during certain prescribed days, particularly during Ramadan, Eid, during daylight hours, during certain months. They forbid you to do this, and they invest an enormous amount of resources into policing these violations of the Quran, of Sharia, and they'll go to great lengths to arrest and detain and question people who are violating these things. But look at how much money these same countries invest in actual crimes and immoral things. There was a documentary made several years ago about Pakistan and the proliferation of child sexual abuse, and the rampant criminality you see within cities like Lahore or Karachi, these huge overpopulated cities. You'll find them policing violations of the Quran, of things that are not even crimes according to a standard definition of what a crime is, or sins. But you'll find very few. You won't find them giving as much interest in apprehending pedophiles or or kidnappers or jihadists, or breaking up jihadist networks. And this holds true throughout the Muslim world because they've invested so much energy into abiding, or at least being seen to abide by the Quran and the example set by Muhammad. So I haven't done. I do talk about the hadiths, the hadith, in certain contexts, but I haven't really gone through Sahih Bukhari or Sahih Islam because it's just so, honestly, it's so, there's so much to tackle. I know David Wood does this a lot in his videos, but to actually go through the hadith would just, in terms of uh, time, it would just consume so much time. I wouldn't be able to do other videos. Even this Quran series, I'm we're almost complete. There are about 50 pages left, but even going through the Quran surah by surah is an extremely time-consuming exercise. So we've been doing this, I think, for half a year, for somewhere between 5 and 6 months, and I'll probably continue through the middle of January. So, like, going through, there are important hadiths which I've mentioned, but I'm not going to really go through the hadith. And I have discussed the Muslim aversion to even the hadith that they consider sahih, and how you have to look at them if you want to see the true character of Muhammad, because there's a lot of things, and there's a lot of verses in the Quran that are without context. So Muslims say don't take the Quran out of context, but the truth is there is no context. It's not arranged in any sort of chronological order. It's simply from the longest surahs to the shortest. So you need to go to the hadith. For example, there's a verse in the Quran about Abu Lahab and his wife being condemned and punished, but it doesn't explain who they are or what sin they've committed. So you would have to go to the hadith to explain that. And this is another reason that the Quran is not the work of God, because there are huge parts of it that are simply make no sense. Ibn Warraq, who is an atheist who grew up in a Muslim country, and he's written a lot of books about this, but he understands Arabic, obviously, but he even said there's about somewhere between a quarter and 30% of the Quran does not make any sense whatsoever. So to try to claim that this is a book created by God, you would have to overlook the fact that so much of it is incomprehensible. With some of it, even with the hadith, even reading the hadith, there are some things in the Quran that just make no sense, like the disjointed letters or the muqatta'at. Even Muslim scholars aren't able to explain what they mean hundreds and hundreds of years after the Quran was compiled. They still don't know what these letters mean. But anyway, yeah, yeah, so like there's no real context to the Quran. You have to either go to the hadith, and even sometimes using the hadith, there are still verses. Ibn Warraq says about 25%. It may be less or maybe more, but there's still verses that don't really have any continuity. Anyway, that is Friday. Friday. Gotta get down on Friday. You can look at the Rebecca Black video for nostalgia's sake after this, but I just needed to do this Surah. I figured I'd do an extra video today just because it is Friday, and I didn't want to. I figured it was relevant to the day, and I will see you next time.